In the dead of night, when everyone was asleep, a shadow was on the move. This is the story of that night, when fear took on a life of its own. In the small, mist-shrouded town of Ravenswood, there was a legend about a bride who never reached her wedding day. People called her the Veiled Widow. Locals whispered that her restless spirit haunted the old, abandoned Blackthorn Manor at the edge of the forest. For decades, the house had stood empty, its grand facade crumbling and windows like dark, watching eyes. It was said the bride could still be seen, pacing the halls, waiting for a groom who never arrived. One rainy autumn evening, a group of college friends gathered around a crackling fire. The topic of the scary bride inevitably came up. Among them was Emily, a skeptic who laughed at the tale. "It's just an old story to keep kids out of an abandoned house," she said. Her friend Greg smirked. "Then prove it. Stay in Blackthorn Manor overnight." The group egged her on, and Emily, fueled by pride and a little too much wine, agreed. Emily arrived at the manor just before midnight. The air was damp, and the wind howled like a warning. Armed with a flashlight and her phone, she pushed open the heavy wooden door. It groaned loudly, echoing through the vast, empty halls. Inside, the house smelled of decay and mildew. Faded portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following her. She found the grand staircase and climbed to the second floor, where the bride's room was said to be. The room was eerily untouched by time. A yellowed wedding gown hung on a mannequin, and a veil draped across a dusty bed. Emily's flashlight flickered as she explored. She paused at the mirror. It was cracked, yet her reflection seemed off. Emily decided to record a video for her friends, mocking the legend. "See? No ghost bride, just an old house." But as she spoke, her phone's screen glitched. Behind her reflection in the mirror, a figure began to materialize. A pale woman in the wedding gown, her face hidden beneath the veil. "Emily," a voice whispered, low and guttural. She spun around, but the room was empty. Shaking it off as her imagination, she decided to lie down for a while. She was exhausted, and the eerie atmosphere was getting to her. Emily awoke to the sound of soft footsteps. The air was freezing, and her breath came out in puffs of mist. She grabbed her flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. From the darkness came the rustling of fabric. She squinted, trying to make sense of the shadows. Then she saw her. The bride stood at the edge of the room, her veil floating as if moved by an unseen breeze. "You're not supposed to be here," the bride whispered, her voice like the creak of an old door. Emily stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. "I'm sorry, I was just leaving," Emily stammered, backing toward the door. But the bride moved faster, gliding across the room without her feet touching the ground. "You can't leave," the bride hissed, her veil lifting slightly to reveal hollow black eyes. "He left me, but you won't." Emily bolted down the stairs, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Behind her, the bride's wails filled the house, a bone-chilling mix of sorrow and rage. "Stay!" the voice screamed, echoing off the walls. Reaching the front door, Emily struggled with the lock, her hands trembling. Suddenly, cold fingers wrapped around her wrist. She turned to see the bride's face up close, rotting flesh and an eternal mournful gaze. "Be my witness," the bride whispered, placing her veil over Emily's head. Emily screamed and yanked free, finally bursting out into the night. She didn't stop running until she reached her car. The next morning, Emily's friends found her sitting in her car, pale and shaking. She didn't say much, only repeating, "She wouldn't let me leave. She wouldn't let me leave." Weeks later, Emily began to change. Her friends noticed she grew distant, her face hollow and her eyes dark. On a whim, Greg visited her apartment, only to find her sitting in front of her mirror, brushing her hair while wearing a vintage wedding gown. "Emily?" he whispered. She turned slowly, her lips curling into a chilling smile. "He's coming for me this time," she said. And from the shadows of the room, a deep, guttural voice replied, "At last." The legend of the veiled widow gained a new chapter, and somewhere in Blackthorn Manor, the bride waits for her next guest.